Welcome. We are excited to present this session on media and the courts, the importance and challenges of such coverage. I am Deborah Gross, the CEO of Pennsylvanians for Modern Courts, a legal nonprofit in Pennsylvania, which provides education and programming about the courts, the judiciary, and the law, and advocates for judicial reforms that promote the rule of law, access to justice, and an inclusive judiciary. Joining me are Judge Idee Fox, the President Judge of the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas, which is our trial level court in Pennsylvania. Judge Fox has been a judge since 1995. She aspired to be a lawyer from the age of 9 and was the first in her family to attend college and earned her law degree from Washington University School of Law in St. Louis. She has faced some interesting challenges during the past year and a half to make sure the courts stayed open for business and for the public. We look forward to hearing about them. Gregg is an extremely accomplished attorney and journalist who recently joined an NPR station in Philadelphia, WHYY, as an on-air afternoon host. She is a past president of the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists, the recipient of 2 regional Edward R. Murrow Awards, and has a deep passion for community outreach. It is not unusual for lawyers to become journalists and for journalists to become lawyers. There are common interests overlapping both occupations. Both are interested in protecting our basic rights, our freedom of expression and democracy. And both professions recognize the importance of independence from public opinion and political pressure. Courts address issues affecting so many aspects of our lives: employment rights, civil rights, health, family disputes, education, housing, just to name a few. Journalists and reporters are the firewall of our democracy. While judges are limited by their code of conduct from publicly speaking out about pending matters and issues in cases before them, the media can shine a light on their decisions and on court proceedings to educate the public and inform all of us. Can each of you tell me a little bit more about your background? I didn't do it justice. Judge Fox, do you want to begin?
Yeah, so I grew up in the city of Philadelphia and came from a family that had very limited education and very limited money, and really wanted to go to college, and wanted to go be a lawyer. I think early on I watched my parents be taken advantage of, and that inspired me to become wanting to be a lawyer. There were TV shows then, that Perry Mason, which no one knows about anymore, another one that no one really knows about, called The Defenders. And to watch people be helped and be able to use those skills to protect people's rights became very important to me. So I was blessed to be able to go to college and law school and come back to the city I love and be able to practice law here, and was elected judge in 1995. First assignment was in family court, where access is extremely important and yet limited for reasons we'll go into as this program continues. And then went on, after 12 years, went into the trial division. I've been in administrative positions for a while, both in family court and in trial, and then was elected president judge by my peers. And that's where I am now. And I will say this: you started by talking about the challenges over the last year and a half because of the pandemic. Those challenges existed before, grew worse as a result of the pandemic. And hopefully as we come out of this, we'll have many lessons learned. And I'll say this, as Gregg, I envy you being on both sides, both journalism and the law. I wish I could have had that adventure.
Thank you. Should I go right ahead, jump in?
Sure, that'd be great.
Judge Fox, I enjoyed hearing about your journey to judge. Very, very interesting. I'm from Washington, D.C., born and raised. Grew up always wanting to be a journalist. From the time I was 12 years old, I used to run around asking questions with a hairbrush, asking people to tell me their stories on the record. I produced my first show when I was 13 in a summer program for middle schoolers. And I went to high school where I was in our television production program at a magnet school in Suitland, Maryland, and hosted the bi-weekly show called The Rampage for my high school. And I produced our video yearbook as well. And then I got a full scholarship to study journalism in college. But I decided in college to go to law school. I ended up working nights at a law firm and just kind of started talking to people and started thinking, this is something I could possibly do. Went to Howard University School of Law. And originally I wanted to work in First Amendment law, ended up doing intellectual property law in Atlanta, Georgia, and made my way back to Philadelphia and to Philadelphia, should I say. Ended up working at a firm here, but then that bug started pulling me. And I decided, if I'm gonna go for the dream that was in my spirit, which was to be a journalist, I ought to do it. So I took a leap of faith. I took a class at Temple University, loved it, and just decided to quit and go for it. And within a year of leaving my law practice, I ended up in radio at KYW News Radio, and I started doing what I call civil rights journalism and covering marginalized communities. I didn't cover courts per se, but I started covering the impact of the justice system on communities. I also started covering the impact of policies on individual rights and sort of created a beat called Community Affairs. And that's what I did for 10 years. And now I'm an on-air host and I do interviews and I'm a big advocate of access to information when it comes not just to courts, but also for our entire legislative process.
So how does your legal background help with your journalism?
I think the way that it helps is it allows me to see issues before they happen. Both journalists and Judge Fox can probably comment on this. I mean, as lawyers, you have to be able to see the issues. I mean, that's why it hurts so bad in law school, because they're like taking a round brain and making it square, or taking a square brain and chiseling a round one out of it. And they force you to see issues. And so, for example, when I first became a journalist, I didn't know the process of journalism, like the deadlines, but I knew certain things. When a law was teed up to pass, I knew what the issues would be. And so I could see the story before it became a story. And so it allowed me an advantage, I think, because I could follow it right away.
Yeah, I mean, I know, in law school, we are taught to just ask questions. We may not know the answers, but we're taught to like ask the questions.
Mm-hmm.
So Judge Fox, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's interesting because one of the problems when you do become a lawyer and when you become a judge, you're very in this narrow sort of path. And for me, making sure you're in touch with what's going on in your community. You can't necessarily be active as a judge, but you can know what's going on. So to me, I'm a real media buff because I read the newspapers, I listen to the radio, and I am a big podcast fan, because that's how you keep up to date with what's going on around you.
You want to expand a little bit on that as to why you are limited by your judicial code as to, in your involvement?
Right. So again, we're state trial judges. We're not appellate judges. So we hear the case before us. We hear the facts. We consider the evidence, make evidentiary rulings, and make a decision. I cannot be influenced by outside issues that may or may not come into the case, which is very different than I can't make up my mind in advance. That doesn't mean that I can't be sensitive to other issues that arise in my community, whether it's racial profiling, whether it's just equity issues that come up in the community that you have to be aware of, that you want to understand. Being a lawyer and being a judge never means you stop learning, and learning about what goes on outside from you and about people and their experiences doesn't necessarily cause you to say A or B when you have to make a decision based on the facts and the evidence you hear. but it does make you understand what people in front of you are saying. And to me, that is so very important. And to me, you get that from the media.
And so Cherri, why is media coverage of the courts so important?
Well, because,
Especially in this day and age, sorry.
yeah, well, I think that we need to understand how the system works. Because if people do not trust the system, there's no democracy, right?
Right.
And so I think the only reason why people follow court orders is because they trust that there is a system in place and that it's fair and that it follows our constitutional rights. And so part of my job is to show the process as it happens and how it works. And I think of all the racial unrest, and I think allowing people to see this process and to feel like no one's hiding anything from them, that their rights are being protected. That is what keeps society in order. The second that people don't trust the system, you get chaos. And I do think that for a long time, there are many communities that just did not trust these systems. And I think we're in a place now where we're trying to change things and trying to show people that it is fair for all people. And so that's why coverage is so important, especially of very controversial topics. It's important that we see how the judge is conducting, how Judge Fox is working behind closed doors, because a lot of people have not been to the courts. A lot of people don't know lawyers. And so part of my job is to shine a light on it and to show that, yes, they are doing the right thing, or this is a problem and we need to fix it.
And that so much ties into the sense of, you're right, if people don't have faith and trust in the courts, then it's chaos. Because again, and I think we've taken as a court for granted that we have that trust. And although if you read about it, the trust in the courts is greater than the other two branches of government, every year it drops. And when you try to look at judges coming on the bench and sitting on the bench and explaining, you have to convey that trust by how you behave and how you explain what you do and how you do it, that you just can't take it for granted anymore. Sorry, you had another question and I interrupted.
No, I was just saying, I was thinking about it because, most people learn about the courts from TV, from movies, and it's not the same. I mean, and it's not always accurate, which can be frustrating.
I have to, as I was thinking about this morning, I was thinking about when I grew up as a kid, there were these TV shows like Perry Mason and The Defenders. Now there are other shows, and I admit I can be a buff. I watch them. I watch Law and Order, and then I scream at the TV. No, you can't do that. That's not right. That's not admissible. So you can really get crazy. So is it accurately portrayed? No. Is it portrayed that it's a system you could trust? No. Does it? And is that somewhere because we're not doing that anymore? It's more entertainment than it is education. That's a hard question to ask.
And I don't mean to cut you off, Judge Fox. I wanted to say that the Cosby case, to me, Judge, you agree that, that was a perfect example. Most people do not understand some of the technicalities, some of the issues, and they immediately thought because Mr. Cosby was released that somehow there was like an innocence, like he was acquitted.
Right.
And that was not the case. And you saw people going left. In the world of social media, there's this knee-jerk reaction. And the first ripple that takes off is what everybody sort of pays attention to, regardless of whether that ripple is correct or not. And a lot of people just misunderstood why he was released. And a lot of people thought it was because he was acquitted, but that wasn't the case. They threw, it was basically overturned because of a prosecutorial misstep, right? And so it didn't mean, it wasn't a guilt or innocence thing. It was a prosecutorial misstep that caused them to basically throw out the case. And so people just went crazy. And that's an example of how media needs to step in, explain it before everything goes left. And everybody has this vast misunderstanding of how the system works.
And what's interesting in that case is the justice who wrote the majority opinion wrote a really long, detailed opinion describing just that. But again, who reads it? I read it because I have to consider these factors. But again, is it read by the general public? No, it's not exciting reading. But at the same time, how we convey that to the public is why we do rely on the media to do that, hope that they will.
Well, and now you say that, and you lead me right into this, like it was a long opinion and people aren't used to reading.
No.
People read tweets, people do Instagram posts, people do, it's a YouTube quick, presentation. So it presents a challenge. Cherri, how do you deal with that when you're a reporter?
It's tough. I mean, I've been on deadline sometimes. I used to cover the U.S. Supreme Court, in June when the decisions would come down. That was my beat, and I used to be on the ready. And then sometimes they tell me to go live, or I'm calling my expert, and they're like, "Can I read the opinion first?" Because there's like this, and the opinion is thick, and you're like, I need like an hour, maybe two, to process this. And we're like, can we go now? Can you be ready at noon? And the opinions come out at 10. So you got to, and so you really are pushing yourself to try to digest this material in a coherent way. But then you have to take a very long, detailed, nuanced opinion and break it down in a minute. And I think people think that's easy. It's the most difficult job to take something very complex and simplify it in a brief amount of time and using simple words we always have to appeal to the common denominator, which is an 8th grade education. So, you're taking a lot of things and you're breaking it down into a very short amount of time, and it's tough. And that is what it is. And then you have to put it in a tweet. Then you have to I had to do stories. I remember covering same-sex marriage. And luckily we had been covering it extensively. So most people understood the issues, but still the order came down. You had to go through and figure it out and then put it in all these platforms very quickly. It's a very tough job, Debbie, very tough job.
And you're not only writing about the majority opinion, right? But there are some very powerful dissents that you also want to report on.
Yes, and you try to mention those. And a lot of times with broadcast, you may not get to it. You may be able to do 1 or 2 sentences, and that's why you have different forms. And Judge Fox said she loves podcasts. Anytime I want to do a deep dive on a topic, sometimes you have to go to multiple places. You may get the quick on the radio, the quick on the television, and then you want something more in depth, you can go to a podcast or an article. So it's also the consumers, all of our listeners out there, they have to make sure that sometimes you got to go a little bit deeper.
I love when you do on NPR, you do a lot of questions and surveys.
Yes.
And then you follow that up with, a deep dive. And I think that's a great way to educate people to see what interests them. And then you sort of, you take that, but you bring more information in. I think that's a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting to me is the effect on the court. To me, as a judge all these years, when you'd write an opinion, and sometimes I would write an opinion from my decision on the bench, not just because it got appealed. And it was very much being conscious of the audience who was going to read the opinion. If I'm writing the opinion to write it for the public, I write it very, very different than if I'm only worried about the appellate courts. They both carry the same weight with the appellate courts, but to me, I have a responsibility to explain what I've done so that it's clear. And that writing, that sense of writing to people common with the 8th grade education is really hard when you've been trained just the opposite in law school. So that transition can be extremely difficult.
It's just as painful as law school. Right?
Yes.
And the words we use as lawyers, they make, people use plaintiffs and defendants, and even those terms are confusing.
You're like, who? And then if it goes all the way up to the top, you're like, well, who's become the petitioner versus, it can be very confusing. Right. I want to point out that in recent years, judges have been forced to have to talk and say something and tweet. When you're seeing the courts go to social media when you're seeing, the Supreme Court justices feeling compelled to speak, that is very unusual. I feel like social media has changed the relationship that the courts have with the public. And I've seen it happen, and even their relationship with us as media professionals, because judges will call you now and say, look, I can't go on the record, but just for background, this is a clarification you may want to think about. And you're like, wow. Or their clerk will call you. And that's something that did not happen before. But like Judge Fox said, with some of these cases, if the public has a misunderstanding, then everything can go left. And a lot of us reporters are not court reporters. Not every, being a lawyer and a journalist is not common. And so you have people who are put on that case for that day. That's not what they normally do. And so there could be a misreading.
Yep.
Especially
and there's a lot of history, right? There's a lot of history that goes into that opinion.
Yes.
And unless you do, and who has the time, but unless you do some background work and understand the underpinnings of the case, it gets confusing. And what you've said is even this pandemic has created some interesting, I'll say, juxtapositions, right? The Supreme Court used to only be in person. Now we can hear it. And some justices who never ask questions now ask questions, surprisingly, right? I guess, what do you think about some courts have changing, I'll say, their acceptance level of coverage, right? Some courts, we got to see the Chauvin trial, as it was happening live, which was phenomenal, but some courts don't allow that. So, why does that happen in some courts and not in other courts? And what do you think, how has that changed the news coverage, really?
Well, I can start with so in the state court in Pennsylvania, we do not allow cameras in the room, have not, and can't do it. And that's been very, very difficult during the pandemic when you needed to provide access, public access, especially to certain proceedings, and at the same time not allow cameras in the courtroom. So it's an interesting dilemma that our Supreme Court's going to have to address at some point. I think the quality of the courtroom proceedings offered to the public in the Chauvin trial was unbelievable. And in the sense that it really, if you did not open that courtroom, and my understanding is the law in that state is both parties have to agree. The prosecution did not agree to have it live broadcast aired, and the judge overruled them and decided to do it anyway. But that was a clear case that if you did that behind closed door, the public would have never trusted the process, the jury verdict. They never would have trusted anything. And that to me was such an example of what happens when you're prepared for it, you understand it's going to happen, you know that sooner or later in your state, and again, every state, all 50 states have their own rule or statute or administrative regulation regarding cameras in the courtroom. So they're not, what happens in Pennsylvania doesn't happen in Minnesota. And what happens in Florida, I think Florida airs everything. So it's different. And you really have to decide, do you just want to show it so people can see it? Or do you want to say, okay, this is a high profile case, I want to see this. And then Cherri, when you started, you talked about access or people's knowledge of what goes on is as important as access into the courtroom. It's very true. And sometimes that information, people being able to see it, even for us in Pennsylvania, if we were to do a mock trial in a courtroom that people may not be allowed into, like certain dependency, but you'd know what went on in those rooms and you'd see it. So the use of media that's available to us now is really a generational shift with the courts that, I will say this, I don't think we've caught up with. The pandemic helped us move forward, but we're not caught up yet.
So, how do you balance also, one of the concerns in Pennsylvania, right, is witness intimidation and individual's right to privacy. How do you balance that between, the public's right to know and these privacy interests?
So if I could start, Cherri, if you're all right with that, I'll
Go
start.
right ahead. Yeah.
As a judge, you have to, sometimes it's statutory. By statute, it's not accessible. The courtroom's not accessible. You have to understand that we do criminal trials in which witnesses may be intimidated. So if you film it and you broadcast it, this came up during the pandemic when we were closed, but we were open and we were trying to make sure we have public access. Do we put it on Zoom where people can film it, where people can see witness faces? How do you do that? How do you protect the witnesses who are afraid that they will be harmed in their community? At the same time, how do you protect a young child who's in the middle of a horrible divorce or custody case with the parents that's going to follow that child? You're going to Google it and know what that child went through and what accusations were made. So that balancing, we often get requests to seal the record. A lot of civil cases, they ask that you seal the record. There is a procedure that the judge has to follow. And one of the interesting points is oftentimes the attorneys agree, like in malpractice cases, the judge still has to follow that process of whether or not I should seal this record. And there's a balancing act between the public's right to know, which is presumed to be the given. That's where you start from. Everything else is trying to say, oh no, I can make an exception in this case. So that need for privacy is going to come in, but it starts with the presumption it's accessible, unless it's statutory.
Yeah, and I will say we have ethical rules. Our goal as journalists is to do no harm. Especially when you're dealing with children and you're dealing with sexual assault victims, we have strict rules within our newsrooms that we're not supposed to publicize those names unless they come forward and give full consent. I think about some of the complications that have come up over the years. I remember Christine Regusters a few years ago, who was convicted of kidnapping a 5-year-old girl from a West Philadelphia elementary school. She had full Muslim gear and the school gave the child to them and they were looking for the child, right? And so they publicized, her and an Amber Alert trying to find her. And then later on, of course, when they did find her, she was alive, but became a victim. And then we had to stop using her name. And so it was like, and then we tried to scrub her name, from our websites, because you think about, she was 5 years old at the time, she was found, and they tried to keep from the public the extent of the injuries that were very brutal. But then this was an ethical dilemma that we had in our newsrooms because when you publicize the name and then they shift status. And so these are all considerations, Debbie, that we think about, as I'm sure you do, Judge Fox. We think about this every single day. I know I'm an advocate in my newsroom and I make sure I try to protect people as much as you can, because with Google, you can search someone's name. Another thing that I try to do is if we follow a case, follow it all the way through, because a lot of times cases are dismissed against people and all you have is that mugshot, and then the facts weren't all out there yet. They later found out this person had an alibi and they didn't do it, but then we have to do that follow-up, right? To clear their name, because the last thing you want to do is be looking for a job and they see that mugshot from that doesn't then go back and say all charges were dismissed and you were acquitted or whatever. So we have to be very careful as media professionals when and know that there are people on the other side.
I think it's so important that there are journalists who are also lawyers and there are judges who were also journalists, so that because the two, the freedom of the press and the right to privacy and our democracy are really all intertwined. So in the last few minutes, do either of you have any, parting words for our audience?
So I can start again. So, because I thought about this question. So first off, let me commend you for all of you who are watching this for your interest in journalism. And let me tell you that this is so important for our understanding our government, our maintaining our democracy, our saving our democracy. this is more important than ever. And we may not always agree on how to proceed with something, but the importance of the courts and the importance of journalism and the media is so intertwined with each other. And I think that's become more and more apparent over these last few years. So good luck to all of you, and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Judge
Absolutely.
Fox.
Great advice. I guess for those of you who want to, this is a beautiful first step in your developing career. I would say put truth above all else. Do no harm. Be right, not first. And last but not least, remember there are always people who are impacted by your words.
And I'm going to end with that because those are both beautiful. So thank you both so very much for joining us. And high school journalists, thank you for listening to us and taking to heart all this, and good luck.